Post Corporeal Existence by Russell Miles. Part 1. The meeting room was a rectangular space, well lit, and with a long table in the centre made of light wood with dark trim. Margaret straightened the black upholstered chairs, placing one chair against the wall. She only needed 7 chairs for this meeting. There was a knock at the door, and a slender woman with short dark hair stepped through. "Is this the right room?" She looked towards Margaret. "I'm here for the validation review." "Yes, it is. I'm Margaret Wise, Assistant to the Secretary of the Sophia Foundation." "My name is Janice." She offered her hand. "Welcome. I'm just getting the room ready." "Can I help?" "Sure. There is a box of notepads and pencils over by the window. If you could place one at each seat." 2 other people stood at the door, a young man and an older woman. "Please come in," said Margaret. "There is tea, coffee and sparkling water over there." Margaret pointed to a table at the far end of the room. "I'm Peter Wynne," replied the young man. "Lin Chi," offered the woman. "Are we late?" "I'm expecting a few more," replied Margaret as they shook hands. Peter went to the table and poured himself a coffee. He looked over a bookcase, lifted out one book, flipped through it, then put it back. Lynn took a seat, opened her handbag and took out a pen and notebook. Another woman arrived. She introduced herself as Kate Payne and then went to make herself a cup of tea. "Can I get anyone anything?" she asked. "Thank you, I'm fine," replied Margaret. Peter gestured with his cup to indicate he had a coffee. Lynn continued writing some notes. A man wearing a grey suit and tie arrived. "Reverend John," said Margaret as she went over and hugged the new arrival. "I'm pleased you could attend." How could I refuse a mysterious email inviting me to an urgent meeting? He smiled broadly, greeting the others. "How are you? Your family?" John looked contemplative. "Oh, the new normal." They stood together for a moment. Then Margaret turned aside. "If you could all take a seat." Margaret walked to the front of the table. "I need to explain the agenda. I apologise that I could not tell you why the urgent invitation." She took a seat and waited as the others shuffled about, taking their own seats. "I'm expecting one other, but I'd like to start." Those at the meeting nodded in affirmation. "Firstly, the Sophia Foundation's Board of Directors has a meeting tomorrow evening. For reasons I shall explain, the Secretary wants your advice on a particular matter the Board is to consider." "This isn't to review grant applications?" asked Peter. "Well, a review of research," replied Margaret as she shifted in her chair, "but not assessing grant applications for the Foundation as you've previously undertaken." She picked up a pencil, twiddling it in her fingers. "I'll explain as best I can." The door opened and a man wearing a suede jacket came in. "Sorry I'm late," he muttered. "Good you could make the meeting, Lewis," said Margaret as she half stood. "Please take a seat. Perhaps we could start with introductions. I know some of you have met, but not all. Lewis, if you can go first." "Lewis Wiseman. I'm a journalist with the Argus." He nodded to John. "We've been in a few grant application reviews." "Margaret was just explaining this isn't about grant applications," replied John. "If we could do the introductions, then I'll explain," interjected Margaret. "John, could you go next?" "My Don is John Davis. I'm a pastor and sometimes lecturer at State University." "Thank you," said Margaret. "Who's next?" "I'll go. My name is Kate Payne. I'm a CEO of the Women's Health Service." "Kate has advised on access and equity issues for many years," added Margaret. The older woman looked around the table. "I'm Lin Chi. I'm a social worker with the Child Protection Service." Margaret gestured towards Peter Wynne, "Our youngest and a mathematician." "A PhD candidate in mathematics." "Peter Wynne," interrupted Lewis. "That's Smith in Vietnamese, isn't it?" Peter rolled his eyes. "A common name." "The name of a revered emperor," added Kate. "More an historical dynasty," Peter clarified. "I guess I'm last. My name is Janice Black. I'm a theatre nurse and educator." "Janice teaches about medical ethics, and we've been pleased she has recently been helping the Foundation," concluded Margaret. Peter stood and went over to refill his coffee cup. "And we have been invited to this esteemed meeting for—" I'll best tell you why we need your help. It's a bit complicated. Perhaps you might like to get a drink before I start. Those at the table remained seated, and after a moment Margaret opened the document she had in front of her. Firstly, the secretary had asked me to stress that if you do not wish to stay, you may leave at any time. I only ask that you treat what we discuss with confidence. So the same as with grant application process as mentioned, Peter. This is somewhat different, Margaret fidgeted. I know you'll respect the Foundation's work. Peter sipped his coffee. I have here a research application. It is 50 years old, approved by a former board of the Foundation. Margaret took out some copies and started passing them around. It was typewritten and a tad faded in parts. Half a century, remarked Kate as she lifted through. I need to explain why we're looking at this now, continued Margaret. The Foundation has agreed to be a party to this research, not just to fund it. It had the right to decide if the results would be published. The research was to be undertaken over 50 years. The Foundation is to decide if they will publish the results. Why wouldn't the results be published, raised Peter. That is the principle of any research, to be accountable. Margaret lifted through the pages and cited. The proposed study is to comply with the National Statement on Ethical Conduct in Human Research, to include the likely benefits of the research must justify any risk of harm or discomfort to the participants. The likely benefits may be to the participants, to the wider community, or to both. She closed the document. If I can continue, I am sure this will become clear. Peter nodded and sipped his coffee again. According to the minutes of the board that I've read over, there were 2 other organisations that made applications for the Foundation to contribute to some complex research. The 2 organisations also had contrary views on the research. Margaret sighed. The Catholic University's Nursing and Health Department had published a study on near-death experiences, which they purported supported their views on an afterlife. She held up her hand to dissuade Peter from interrupting. This research was interviews of 47 patients who had experienced cardiac episodes and were revived, and then asked about their experiences. Margaret flipped through her notes. There were over 150 patients who had been revived over an 18-month period. 47 were interviewed or agreed to be interviewed. They reported on outer-body experiences, feeling of peace, seeing a light, and a meeting of deceased loved ones. Margaret paused and then continued. There had been a public meeting to discuss this research that included the Humanist Society. These are the 2 parties to the research. At this debate, the Humanists argued that the research was symbiotic in nature and, while valid about a person's experience, could not support a general outcome about an afterlife. A post hoc ergo propter hoc error, injected Peter. What error? Asked John. Observing something after the fact and imputing an effect, replied Peter. John squinted his eyes. My dog has 4 legs, my cat has 4 legs, therefore my dog is a cat, said Janice. Except it isn't. I'm confused, said Kate. Doesn't matter, said Margaret. The thing is, the 2 organisations agreed that the research of cardiac patients was not compelling. Lynn looked up from her notepad. This is interesting. Apparently a member of the audience asked what methodology might produce valid results. The humanist said this would be a hypothesis that predicted a certain outcome that could be tested. There had apparently been experiments involved asking revived patients if they could recall a message written out of view on the top of a cupboard in an operating theatre. This was dismissed as not showing experience after death. They settled on the idea of linking unique numbers that would produce a very rare output. The candidates would be asked to memorise these numbers and see if a person experiencing a near-death experience might know the sum of a number known to someone who had previously died. The 2 organisations agreed to work together to refine this idea and determined it would be broad-scale, long-term and costly. So they approached the Foundation to provide funding and to audit the results. This proposal is in the document in front of you. I suggest you take time to read through it and then I'll return. Those around the table looked from side to side, as if finally comprehending why they were there. "There has been a result," said Lynn. "You have recently had a result. This is why we have been asked here. I'd like you to read through the report first. The board wants advice on whether to publish or not." Margaret gathered her documents. "I'll let you read through and I'll return shortly." "I'm leaving," said Lewis. "Why are you leaving?" asked John. "I don't have to explain my decision." He stood up. "I can leave, can't I?" "Yes," said Margaret. "You'll be paid for the entire day. You can leave at any time. Anyone can leave if they want to." Margaret walked with Lewis to the door. "I'll be back in half an hour. The toilets are down the hallway. Call on my mobile phone if you need anything." The two of them left. Part 2. Post Corporeal Existence. Margaret flipped through the copy of the research proposal. "I'm not sure if I want to be involved. I don't understand what the researchers were on about." She stood and walked over to the coffee stand and poured a glass of water. "I need to read through the proposal," remarked John. He lifted the report and leafed through a dozen or so pages. "It isn't that long." Kate strolled over to Lynn, who was scrawling notes as she read the report. "What do you make of it?" "I haven't finished reading it." "Perhaps we ought to read it through, as Margaret advised," offered John, as he made himself a coffee. "We can call Margaret back to ask for any clarification," added Janice, "but I need a cup of tea." "I like a tea too, black," said Kate. "I'll be mum," cried Peter. He went to the table and started arranging cups, clarifying who wanted what. "It is really not that complicated." He dangled tea bags, adding milk and sugar as required. "The proposal mentions that the researchers felt that a sample of 10,000 would be required to give a reasonable chance of a result, or not being too many for a catchment area. They settled on patients from the Catholic University Hospital, so only one place to look out for response." "What responses?" asked Kate. "What are these 3-digit numbers about?" "A number that was not too large to remember," offered John as he lifted a page pointing to a line. "What page?" queried Janice. "And what are triangular numbers?" Peter went to a whiteboard on one side of the room, wiped it clean. "Would you like me to explain triangular numbers?" "Please," nodded Janice. Peter looked around the others. "Remember what Margaret said about patients being asked to memorise numbers? Then if a person had a near-death experience, was able to express a number which was the sum of that number and another number assigned to someone who had died?" "Sum of," said John. "An amount from the addition of 2 or more numbers. Addition. 1 plus 1 equals 2. "Thank you. Mathematics was not my strong point." Peter grinned. "Anyway, they did not want just any number, as that would be unwieldy. It seemed they also thought special numbers would be harder to predict at random." Peter took up a marker and started writing. "A special number is something that can create an unusual result for an application." He wrote pi. "This is an example, the constant of the ratio of the circumference of a circle. A prime number is another. It can only be divided by 1 or itself." He wrote 3, 5, 7, 11. "The researchers settled on triangular numbers. These are numbers that can be arranged in the shape of an equilateral triangle when represented as dots." He wrote it down. "T1 equals 2 brackets 1 plus 1 close brackets equal 1. T2 equals 2 brackets 2 plus 1 close brackets 2 equals 3. T3 equals 3 brackets 3 plus 1 close brackets 2 equals 6. "I'm more confused, whined Kate. "It doesn't matter. It's a formula that creates a list of different numbers. There are 31 triangular numbers between 1 and 499. They assign patients one of these numbers to remember." Lynn was circling something on a notepad. "Where does 499 come from?" Peter sipped his coffee. "Lukewarm." "Would you like me to make a fresh cup of coffee?" asked Janice. "Please." Janice walked to the table. "I mentioned 10,000 samples. This is on page..." Peter picked up the report and thumbed through it. "Page 11. But if you read on, the researchers decided that was too large. It would require a 4-digit number for patients to remember. 999 is the maximum number a 3-digit number allows." Janice held up a jug. "Milk?" "Just a little." "Sugar?" "No." Janice poured from the jug. They also wanted the results to be no more than 3 digits. If the numbers are to be added to give this maximum, it could be no more than 499. There are 31 triangular numbers between 1 and 499. Janice carried the cup to Peter and handed it to him. Thank you. Pleasure. Finally, the researchers wanted to exclude numbers less than 100, as they would have zeros in front of them, such as 054 or 003. They felt zeros would add undue confusion. This left 18 triangular numbers between 100 and 499. Peter lifted his cup and sipped. Lynn looked up, then down at her notes, and up again. I understand. It doesn't matter how the numbers were created, just that there was a series of unique numbers. Essentially, responded Peter. I'm more interested in the use of the numbers, offered Lynn. The proposal says candidates were to be selected from patients at the Catholic University Hospital. Over a period of 4 weeks, patients aged between 18 and 65 would be assigned numbers. The numbers would be added to their existing patient number with an explanation that this was an identifier for a blood test. Where are you reading? Inquired Janice, now standing near the window holding the report in her hands. Appendix C, page 23. Janice leafed through the report. You said they had a result, interjected John. Won't we talk about that? Lynn ran her hand through her short hair. I deduced that there had been a result. She rested her chin on her hand. I believe we need to work through the report so we can understand any result, offered Peter. I want to go home, said Kate. Please stay, replied Janice. We need your help. This is important. I said I wanted to go home, but I'm staying. I don't feel it fair to leave this problem to a few. Lewis should have stayed. I'm annoyed at him. If I might continue, proffered Lynn. Please, said Peter. Lynn turned over her own notes. It says the study was to be incorporated in unrelated medical research, a study of liver disease to develop a diagnostic test for hepatitis B. The scientists involved in that study would be unaware of the secondary purpose. The idea was that the candidates would observe this 3-digit identifier without being aware of its other purpose. John looked up. What about the issue of consent and ethics for this secondary study? It says that the patients would consent to the blood samples, offered Lynn. You have to remember that practices and ideas about informed consent were different in those days, offered Janice. They did not care about turning up folks' entire religious and spiritual views, interjected John. The candidates were expected to be dead, snickered Peter. The 50-year time frame was selected as an actuarially the patients were expected to have died, said Lynn. A database of who had been assigned which number. The numbers would be used more than once, would be kept by the Foundation. She turned back a few pages in the report. There is consideration as to extracting the results. Extracting what? Blood samples? Said John. Remembrances of numbers, rather the sum of 2 numbers as Peter described. Any patient who experienced a serious medical episode, the researchers are clear about using that term as opposed to near-death experience, which was not a scientific concept. A patient expressing a 3-digit number would be checked against a list of candidates at the Foundation to see if they were valid. That is what perplexes me, said Janice. Who at a hospital collects random remarks of patients who are likely to be not fully there? Who do they advise? How does this information get to the Foundation? Lynn turned over her notes. This was clearly an issue for the researchers. The protocol was that 3 people at the hospital were to be aware of the secondary purpose of the numbers. The CEO, the senior medical registrar, and the director of nursing. They were to advise the hospital staff under some pretext to note any expression of 3-digit numbers. The researchers acknowledged this was unusual, but did not feel there was any better option. I guess it was no stranger than asking patients about lights at the end of a tunnel, meeting great Aunt Maud, and what other studies were doing. They were trying to improve the methodology. They stated in the conclusion it was not perfect, and that over half a century time frame people might just not bother, thinking it all pointless. Spending a lot of time and money on silly research, interjected Peter. The results will be considered positive if a number offered by a patient, when subtracted from the number that had been previously assigned, matched a number assigned to a now deceased patient, said Lynn. Perhaps we ought to ask Margaret to come back, said Kate. She may have some thoughts. Sounds quite spurious, said John. I'd also like something to eat. Let's get Margaret. As spurious as talking snakes, virgin births and zombies, quirked Peter. Lunchtime then, said Kate. I'll get Margaret. Part 3. Post Corporeal Existence. I bought a range of items for lunch, offered Margaret as she came into the room holding a tray covered in plastic wrap, along with a bottle of fruit juice. There is ham and cheese wraps, rice paper rolls. She laid the tray down and pulled off the plastic wrapping. Vegan, asked Kate. Some of the rice paper rolls are vegetable, and I think this is quinoa salad. Some of the rice paper rolls are vegetable, and I think this is quinoa salad, she said as she uncovered a bean mix, then proceeded to place out paper plates and cutlery. Kate came over, poked at the salad, and then laid it some onto her plate. There is a selection of pastries, said Margaret. Peter hopped off a bench on which he was leaning and went to the array of lunch. The toilet is down the hallway, asked Janice. To the left, 2 doors down, said Margaret. I need to go too, announced John. Leave some pastries for me, Peter. Peter smirked as he continued filling his plate. Len remained sitting. The results of the study, what were they? If we can wait till everyone has gotten something to eat, then I'll go over the information that I have. Margaret placed a few things in a plate and poured herself a fruit juice. How long have you been assistant secretary? Asked Peter as he sat down with his plate. I'm assistant to the secretary, not quite as grand. She sat next to Peter. Still, that must be fascinating. Issues of cosmology, biology, consciousness and the nature of reality, ethics and meeting eminent business leaders, academics, public figures. I met Professor Frank Wilcox last year. He was enthralling. He listened to you. I felt valued, not just responded to. Nobel laureate. I wish I could have been there. I find the connection between quarks and gluons fascinating, said Peter. Margaret sipped a drink. He mentioned that briefly, but mostly spoke about his religious feelings, Catholicism, and how it influenced his growth and development. John returned. Who was talking about Catholicism? Did that come up in the study? We were talking about Professor Wilcox, mentioned Peter. Professor who? Retorted John. If we might continue, intruded Margaret. If you don't mind eating while I speak. Janice isn't back, said Kate. Let me fill my coffee cup, said Peter. I want to hear, said John, and took another mouthful. I'll wait, said Margaret. Anyone else need to use the toilets before I start? They moved around the table, taking seats. Then Janice came back and sat. She ignored her plate. Margaret smoothed her skirt and looked down at her notes. As I mentioned, the research required collecting and checking any 3-digit expressions made by patients who had return of spontaneous circulation. That is the medical term used. Margaret looked at Janice. That is correct, perhaps post-arrest or post-resuscitation. Thank you. Margaret smoothed her dress again. There are a few occurrences, 12 in total, where the hospital staff documented 3-digit expressions. Most were in the initial decade until about 20 years ago. None met the study's criteria. The numbers, when subtracted from the numbers originally assigned to the person, did not match any number of a deceased person, Peter clarified. Margaret nodded. I wonder if lack of interest by hospital staff influenced the decline in records, said Kate. Lynn moved about collecting paper plates and putting them in the rubbish bin. I can't see nurses paying much attention to a procedure that they had no standing of the purpose, added Janice. Even if they'd known the purposes, nurses have much to do for the living without concern for the long dead. There was a result, John stood. What was it? Margaret sighed. 4 weeks ago, just before the last board meeting, the current hospital CEO sent an email. He said he was following protocol in contacting the foundation. It took some time for the secretary to be advised. I didn't know anything about the study. It seems no one else did. But what was the result? John stepped towards Margaret. Margaret read slowly and clearly. Upon experiencing a cardiac result, the patient, once resuscitated, verbally communicated a sequence of 6 numerals, which he reiterated 5 times, as reported by the attending nursing staff. Subsequently, the patient suffered another cardiac arrest and, despite resuscitative efforts, could not be revived. 6 numbers, no result then, stated Peter. John remained standing, glaring at Margaret. The number was comprised of 3 digits repeated twice. The 3 digits were checked against the database and when subtracted matched the number of a former patient at the hospital, now deceased. Margaret looked directly at John. This circumstance was not covered by the research protocols. Nothing about sequence of numbers. The Secretary determined this was a negative result and so intends to advise the board. It's not a negative result, explained John. It's just a number repeated twice. That is what you may conclude, said Margaret from her seat. John turned about and returned to his own seat. The researchers must have considered that seriously ill patients might quickly die, mentioned Janice. Nothing in the proposal about interviewing patients about what they may have meant. Why are we here then? Asked Kate. Peter smiled. Because others will learn of the result. The Catholic University, the humanist. The protocol says they must be advised. They'll make statements, contradictory statements to be sure. If the Foundation says nothing, it will appear foolish. Foolish for agreeing to the research in the first place, said Lynn. We are the public relations cover, said Peter. The board can announce what it chooses, say it is consulted, follow procedures, looks much better than anyone else's assertion. Kate stood up. I don't see any need to discuss this further. This is the board's problem. I suggest we leave them to it. She gathered her handbag and looked about, then walked to the door, opened it, and left. You are free to leave if you choose, said Margaret. The remainder looked at each other as they sat around the table. Part 4. Post Corporeal Existence. The result is important. A message from the dead, stated John. That must be published. Janice looked towards Margaret. What will be published? As I previously said, the Secretary's advised that the research failed to meet its objectives, and in hindsight could not have. Margaret leaned forward. However, the Secretary wanted further advice considering the significant funding devoted to this research. There was the result. It wasn't a failure, said John. What could we possibly add, said Janice, ignoring John. We could say there was a message. It's ambivalent at best, argued Janice. If we could address the concerns that had you invited, said Margaret. What else? John began to spatter before Peter said, over him. The issue of the Foundation's reputation, inserted Peter. When the results are published, which they must be, as the Foundation does not control what the Catholic University Humanist Society must say. He tilted his head. The Foundation is a lauded body for supporting research. It has associations with a wide range of folk, professors, bishops, business and politicians. It receives considerable donations towards its work. Peter looked directly at the others. Do we want to see the Foundation continue its work? Why is that a concern, said John. It may not be, continued Peter. I'm merely saying that is why we were invited to consider. The Foundation has been around for generations, said Janice. What does this matter? I guess the Secretary feels it might, said Margaret. He wanted your advice as to how this research might best be dealt with. If the Foundation asserted it was bogus, there will be accusations of a cover-up. If it says it was portable, the practice of the Foundation will be critiqued. Peter lifted his cup, seeing it empty, placed it down again. Quite a quandary. John cupped his hand together over his mouth, leaning forward. Peter tilted his head, tapping his finger. Lynn leafed through her notes. Can we offer our own personal views? Asked Janice, as she rolled some antibacterial gel through her hands. You don't have to be unanimous, answered Janice. She waited with hands resting on her table. John's mobile phone rang. He picked it up and stifled the ring. I have a thought, offered Peter. I'd like to hear your thoughts, said Janice. The others nodded to indicate affirmation. The result is interesting, but inconclusive. I feel the researchers exaggerated the statistical unlikeliness of their methodology. What do you mean? Asked Janice. The researchers assumed the chances of a matches of any triangular numbers to be quite small, where there's a good chances of numbers adding up, or in this case subtracting. Peter went to the whiteboard and wiped off his earlier work. The assessment was based on Bayesian test of probability of an event. He wrote x equals match. Then x equals a times b times c times d times e times f. If a is the chances of any two patients being in hospital at the time numbers were assigned, we could assign 0.5 or 50-50 for the sake of argument. Then b is the chance of one of these two dying and being revived. Again, we'll assume 50-50. C is the chance of a person expressing a 3-digit number, which is also 50-50. D, a nurse writing down this number, and E, the number being passed to the Foundation, and F, a match. Why are we assuming 50-50 for these odds? Raised John as he leant back. You can't possibly know if it might be 1 in 2, 1 in 1,000 or anything. Peter paused and clasped one hand over which he was holding the marker. I'm not following, added Janice, shaking her head. The ratios don't matter. I'm just imputing them to demonstrate how the researchers calculated the probability. They did not know either. If you look at page 25, last paragraph, they explain their methodology. Janice turned over the pages and looked down. Can I continue? Said Peter. No one said anything. Peter wrote 1 times brackets 0.5 brackets to the power of 6. I thus have a calculation of 1 multiplied by 0.5, which equals 0.25. Multiply this result again by 0.5, the answer is 0.125. And if I keep multiplying the results by 0.5, Peter wrote out the figures as he spoke, and again 6 times in total. He stopped for a moment. Then the answer is 0.015625, or 1.5%. He walked back to his seat. The researchers took what they felt as a conservative assumption of 50-50, so thought the odds of any number being obtained at random as 1.5%. Then, with the results needing to be triangular between 1 and 500, they needed to compound this by 31. If you look at the last line, the researchers offered that this was the conservative assumption. That is, what is the likelihood of a nurse decades later seeing any significance in the random expression of a patient? They suggested that the number coming up by chance was thousands, millions. Peter sat down. I'm more confused, stressed Janice. Don't worry, replied Peter. The only thing we might observe is the researchers were really bad at statistics. The research was actually around the chances of 13 numbers, the number of triangular numbers between 100 and 499. A single event. The odds are 1 in 13. Not likely, but possible. So the research project was bollocks from the start, said Margaret. Pretty much so, answered Peter. And you observed this from the beginning, stated Lynn. She folded a notebook. You might have mentioned this sooner. Peter chortled. I thought there was going to be a video recording of a poltergeist, ghost riding, or the resurrection. You're being blasphemous, asserted John. I apologise, John. Peter clasped his hands together in mocking gesture. I was more querying what sort of evidence would demonstrate post corporeal existence, or the oxymoronic life after death. John glowered. But you already have evidence in your sacred script, said Peter. I appreciate if you could focus on the issue at hand, interposed Margaret. Boys, smirked Janice. I read a novel by Robert Harris, began Len. The main character said that the sin he feared most was certainty. If there was only certainty, and if there was no doubt, there would be no mystery, and therefore no need for faith. Mysticism compared to science, said Peter. 2 different magisteria, and that is what we have here. If I could propose that we determine what we advise the board, if anything, said Margaret. What can we say other than the research is inconclusive, offered Janice. Could any research produce compelling evidence, continued Margaret, before anyone else can speak? There were 3 digits that matched, merely repeated for clarity, stressed John. Peter said that might have been by chance, added Janice. And it may not. Another study might provide more responses, added John. The board is not going to approve another research project, said Margaret. They are clear they would not have funded this research if given a choice. They feel this research erodes the public trust in institutions with scant prospect of advancing knowledge and the diversion of funds from productive endeavours. Demonstrating a power beyond their own, that we may aspire to be supremely contented regardless of the flaws of the world. John held an open hand in front of him. This is certainly a laudable advancement of knowledge regardless of the cost. But Peter has advised that the research is flawed, well, from a mathematical point of view, said Janice. We really need to be winding up, said Margaret. I have to help prepare for the board meeting, including any advice you may offer. Peter leaned to one side while doodling on a piece of paper. I said the methodology was unsound. I didn't say there wasn't a viable mathematical construct. The others looked towards Peter. I don't know why the researchers chose triangular numbers. They are not that rare, and they are predictable. Perhaps they look tidy or easy for the researchers to understand. He continued doodling. I still cannot see why anyone would bother. What does it matter? God matters, declared John. To you, to religious adherents for sure, Peter glanced at John. But you'll believe regardless of any proof, faith and all. He looked around at those at the table. But most of us are indifferent to the God not God thing. It matters little how we live, thrive and survive. How would you set up the research, Peter asked Janice. Wait, injected Glenn. Peter might not want to say. It's all right. I'd suggest another special numbers that are rarer. Amical numbers, perfect numbers. What is a perfect number? Asked Janice. A perfect number is a positive integer that equals the sum of its proper divisors, except itself. 6, 28, 496, 8,128. The chances of such in a set is very rare. Peter tapped his pencil. The reliance on ill folk being revised still seems odd. Is there any reason why a message from beyond can't be received in another way? Seances, deaf-mute speaking, signs written in sand? But this is wishful thinking, nothing to do with science. Can you suggest a proper method of receiving messages? Asked Janice. The resurrection of a dead person? Peter stood up. I have to go, work to do. John shook his head. Peter walked over to John and placed his hands on John's shoulders. That didn't work out for Lazarus. Thomas still doubted. I feel empty, said Janice with a forlorn look. I'd like to talk with my mother again. Peter turned towards the others. I wish I could talk to my sister. She teased me when we were young, but looked after me, prepared dinner when Mum was late. I miss her. We all miss someone, offered John as he stood up. Thank you for your input, Peter. He picked up a copy of the report and placed it down again. I know a bit more about mathematics. John took Peter's hand. You're okay, thank you. This has been fascinating, said Glenn. I hope I'll meet you all again. She picked up her notes, shuffled them so that they were even and put them in a handbag. I guess I need to go too. Janet stood up. Thank you for your attendance, said Margaret. The end. The mathematical formula has been simplified, and the quote from Robert Harris is from his novel Conclave.